Thank you very much. I'm very honoured to be here at this conference and to appear among so many august and expert speakers. Most of what I'm talking about has no pictures, or if they do, they're inside, you'll find them. I just wanted to start with one poem. It's called The Ring of Brodgar. I spend a lot of my time in Orkney. Winds pass my ear on beacon mound, tell me to sit upon the ground, to listen close, ancestrally, to sound the circle, gather in seed heads of silence, whispering. Secrets of sedges, curlews cry, visiting coaches all gone by. Alone I sit to listen the call. A chant of larks now lend their song over the ring stones of ritual throng. Here was hallowed the beer and wheat, circled by urgent dancing feet. A grist of stars the sower flings, a horseshoe's cast to each knifed stone, that each may know his kindred's own. Across the hills the sun still roams, to quicken the grain with slanting combs, to bright the lock and shadow the strand, to call the dancers from their ground back to the ancient dancing ground. And so, till moonlight owl-wise swings out of the lock on silent wings, and darkness pulls its star cape fast, till stone and star one singing sound, enclasped with joy in one dance wound. Shadow of song, your echoes linger over each tuneful pointing finger. Sheafs of stars their music stook. Grant I may sing their ancient store, and by that singing want no more. So we each have our own sense when we visit the spirit of these places. They sing and speak to us. And these are places that are never separate from their setting or their place, nor from the ancestral consciousness that created them. So I'm talking today from the focus of the temporal resonance of ancient and ancestral landscapes and how they can reveal to us a timeless belonging. Now, my personal qualification to speak from this viewpoint is entirely down to my childhood sight problems. I was born very short-sighted to the extent that I had to rely more on sound than on sight to navigate the world. So I would sing into spaces in order to check where the things were, so I could avoid walking into them. But when you do that, you not only find what's there, it also shows you what's not there. And so I'm wired to be resonant and to experience things through echolocation. So when I come to a sacred place, I experience places as a soundscape for this purpose. And indeed, that's how I've experienced places all my life. Now, the first woman to study archaeology and anthropology, Jacquetta Hawkes, in her 1951 book, The Land, hints at this because she speaks of birds as now representing the continued presence of the past, which is evoked by the singing, whistling, and calling that fell into millions of ancestral ears and there left images for us all to inherit. So to illustrate her remark, I'm just going to do a little reminiscence of when I visited a late Bronze Age site, a settlement at Must Farm near Whittlesea on the Fens. So this settlement was found in the most extraordinary state of preservation 20 years ago. It was originally built on stakes over a river channel and surrounded by a palisade of sharpened stakes. And it was only occupied for about 9 months, and the settlement was destroyed. A blaze took over all of the house's contents, and they just literally fell into the muddy river below. And then, of course, the fenland took over after that. But the combination of this charring and waterlogging created the perfect conditions for thousands of objects to survive: pottery, wooden artifacts, fibre, metalwork. We don't normally have the ability to see things like that in their original condition. Usually what's left when these things are rotted away is just the metal and the stone, which of course have their own singing, which we'll go on to talk about. So the remains of these dwellings have been left mostly in situ, apart from the smaller objects which are now in the museum. But the enclosures of where the settlements are, you can go inside and you can circulate on sort of raised walkways, so you can look down onto the remains just as they were. And so standing in one of these vast enclosures very quietly on my visit and listening to the remains, I found myself whistling in a manner which is not like my normal mode of whistling. And John, who was with me, said it sounded like people whistling over the reeds in order to signal to each other or to communicate over distances. And with that sound, there was suddenly an evocation of that habitat, for the whistling was like a series of bird-like cries, but emanating from the mouths of ancient people. And I think because I was there with that, the ancestors also became aware of me. And maybe for about 15 minutes, time didn't run in any way. There was this balanced attention between now and then. And that's not something that always happens at an ancient site, as I'll explain. But it stands as an example of what happens when we slow down and purposely attend to a place. This kind of evocation can be done without any kind of agenda. When I visit a place, I usually just get myself out of the way and attend and listen to what's there. But I can only tell you more about it when I go and revisit Must Farm again, because it's in the revisiting that the dialogue opens up. So the sustained presence of the presence of a place has its own signature, even though the habitat and the surroundings may have changed greatly, where wetlands have dried up or coastlands eroded, or they turn into salt flats and then into solid ground. But there are all sorts of other ancestral survivals which are less tangible but just as important. So over the last sort of 55 years or so, I've learned that some ages are more mythically and deeply resonant than at other ages are. So we see this in all sorts of ways in fashion, where certain things come back from earlier eras, in fashion, art, and culture. But there are other sorts of things as well. And I'm recalling back in the late 70s and early 80s, myself and several practitioners in the magical groups I was working with at that time, several of us had a sense that the Neolithic strata of ancestral communication was available again in a very different and very immediate way. It was making available something that had been held in the dormancy of sleep, it felt. Or rather like when you have one of those old dial radios, when the dial finally hits the wave band and you actually hear music. So my understanding of that awakening, looking back on it, was that it was to do with the ancient British tradition of the sleepers. So this is a mythic theme where the spirits of a land or place go into a state of dormancy, only to come awake at certain times. Of course, the most famous of which we all know is the myth of the return of King Arthur. But the tradition of the sleepers is, of course, across the world, right the way down into things like the Sleeping Beauty folk story. But I'm sure we've all visited a megalithic place that felt disappointingly uninviting or spiritually withdrawn. It's rather like how my cat responds to me when I've been away here for a few days and I just get a solid back turning. There's a fugu down in Cornwall where I think I experienced that for about 9 years running of, no, you can't come in. And despite the fact that the dormancy of most sites is often periodic and even sometimes seasonal, for us it may mean that some sites may not become awake again in our current lifetimes. I'm sorry, the Neolithic exchange you were calling is unavailable at present. Do try again later. So one of my colleagues in that work back in the day was my spiritual brother R.J. Stewart, who had the sense that the makers of the ancient temples and sacred complexes made them not just for themselves and their own people, but for us, their descendants, who live long after them in ages uncounted. And he was right, because look, we're all here today to honour the stones and their makers. But we would not have begun our work without several of the guardians of those places waking up and coming online again. So at that time we visited not only stones, but hills, burrows, and more out-of-the-way places, both to listen and to hear. And it was, in many ways, like going to a series of local meetings around the country. And it seemed important that we came as a group, not always with the same combination of people, but because it felt that the community of ancestors needed to receive, as it were, a delegation of us. And so there we were. And of course, we were also aware that there were other people who were responding to this Neolithic call, and that some of them, particularly groups from overseas, seemed to be quite keen on retuning the sites to their own agenda in some manner. And there was quite a lot of crystal implanting and things of that ilk, which was quite rather annoying. And part of our work was, if we noticed one of these things, to just dig it up, because quite honestly, the sites were ardently eloquent without the addition of amplification, let alone the hubris that retuning implied. So we tried to come to each site clean-handed, without any agenda other than to listen and to respond in ritual or song, but to leave the site without any physical trace of our coming. And we went on to spend time at various places located near to us to see if individual dialogues were possible. The results of some of this work you can read about in the appendix of R.J. Stewart's book, The Underworld Initiation, where one such dialogue was opened up with the guardian of a Neolithic passage grave at Les Montgrantres on the island of Jersey in the Channel Islands. So the guardian of that site was the spirit of an ancestor who had become ritually resonant, not only to the site, but also to the wider environment and his people. For him, he was responsible for mediating what he called earth peace. This was a power that resulted from his own integration with the site, which was able to link and mediate through various stages of human and non-human evolution, and which we may understand as being one of the deepest forms of participation at a sacred site, where the soul itself is taken into a wider service on behalf of a community beyond time. R.J. said that he understood that for his people, this guardian may have been regarded as, we might imagine, the oracle of a shrine, a being whose access to knowledge was amplified by his role. And I suppose much as we might today think of a figure like Merlin, who is seen to be more than a man or an ancestor and has become one with the earth in a way that we have not, but not in any grandiose, literal-minded or self-identified way, I hasten to add. For the guardian, it was a matter of honour that he was there merged utterly with the site and to become part of it. And at the beginning, I know R.J. didn't have much of an easy interface with him. It was either both sporadic or much too full-on. And it was only when the guardian suggested to him that any inquirer should imagine approaching the chamber where the guardian was through a tiny crawl space where consultation could take place. And R.J. felt this was probably a common pattern of dolmen and passage graves throughout northwest Europe, except for those that had failed to retain their guardian. Well, I can no longer physically get into any of those crawl spaces myself, but we don't need to. We can still remember the places that we have visited. He understood at the time that any inquirer was entering into this two-way flow with this method, that the guardian of a place learns also about your own awareness and transmits it to his people, while you learn about their awareness and bring it forward in your own self, with the guardian occupying a middle or mediating point, which made nonsense of time and space, because, as R.J. writes, on attempting to convey to the guardian the meaning of the flow of time, the response from him was the equivalent of, there is no such line or such a shape. There is only turning, until you are inside the earth, and from the little turning to the great turning that is inside the little turning. Inside the great turning, there is earth peace. Now, this particular passage grave was excavated in 1912, and the main chamber contained the remains of 6 adults and a child in a crouched position, with animal bones and other grave goods. But interestingly, there was a further skeleton found in a seated position, propped up by a colourful pile of sea pebbles in a separate chamber. So, however you understand this dialogue, I'm mentioning it here as an example of the kind of work we were doing back then, and also the kind of resonance that's between us and ancestral knowledge. Now, both myself and RJ work in a primary way through music as well as poetry and song, which have been really the main modes in which we've conducted this work. And I think I've learned more from the ancestors doing this sort of work at the time, going around the different Neolithic and other sites that I have from any level of my work since. So the sheer willingness of someone like the guardian of this site to serve in this capacity gives us a lesson in humility. I mean, to be attuned to the greater guardians of the land who are still active is a level of service that I'm sure that not very many of us would be offering ourselves forward for doing that. Not something as beneficial or feasible as a career choice. And I'm very glad that Maria mentioned this morning, because it was, in RJ's own words, an honour for the guardian to be voluntarily given to this site and tuned to it. So this uneasy interface that RJ experienced initially was about his trying to promote his own idea of time upon the guardian, and the guardian's sense of the great turning that is inside the little turning reminds me very much of the myths surrounding Brú na Bóinne, Newgrange in Ireland, with its midwinter morning sun passageway. The myths of this site are very specifically and primarily about the stopping of time and an entering into timelessness, initially so that the Doida can sleep with Boan, who conceives Angus Mac an Daog, and who is born, of course, in a day and a night. But in later Irish legend, we hear also how the inhabitants of the Brú and of the other she mounds were sustained. And here it is Manannán mac Lir, who is an older Neolithic being, who oversees the going in of the Tuatha De Danann, the Celtic Age people of Danu, into the Hollow Hills. He creates for them the Fé Fiatha, the fairy cordon, an invisible boundary that sustains their belonging in the place. And he also gives them the feast of Glivni, the brewing of a drink that cancels all earthly sickness. And lastly, he gives them perpetual pig, which is a pig that can be killed and eaten today, and as long as you don't break any of its bones, will be a whole living pig again tomorrow. So this concept of the Fé Fiatha, which literally translates as the deer's sinew from the Gaelic, is about being seen and unseen. And within this cordon, the inhabitants of the she mounds can see out, but none can see in. For them, going into the Hollow Hills is an enlargement and a welcome, and the Fé Fiatha sustains the conjoined ancestral memory into everlastingness. So my own understanding about Neolithic customs of ancestralizing the dead, that is, enshrining them as ancestors, suggests that after the body was processed immediately after death, it was still a dead person. But when it had been defleshed and it had rites, it needed another kind of process whereby they were not just the dead, they were ready to be installed or enshrined as ancestors, or brought into that greater memory. We know that many of the midwinter ceremonies were probably the time when ancestral remains or ashes were indeed brought to be changed or ancestralized by the returning sun. And this process was not necessarily how a site guardian, such as I've been talking about, might have been attuned to the site where he was. But my sense is that the effect of the ancestralizing ritual was to join the living memories of the dead together so that individual ancestors were alive at a collective ancestral level. So from RJ's encounter, we can see how many of the stone monuments and temples may also have been for the enlarging of our hearts and souls into a focused ancestral consciousness. And while I think, we think of the stones as being aligned to terrestrial and celestial points, we might consider that they have also this other function to bring us into alignment, whereby this ancestral communication can continue to take place, whereby we become part of the memories. If so, it would bring us into a more classical sense of cosmos as being all that is seen and unseen, and our ability to broaden our consciousness so that we may perceive the universe within that ancestral unity is a great part of this. It is part the way of belonging. Now, I've been talking about ancestors in this kind of rather loose way, but I need to frame the word more clearly. Mostly because we live in a society that's largely ignored or disregarded the ancestors. And for most people, the word just means those relatives who came immediately before you, or even something more risible. I have one publisher in America to whom I proposed an ancestral title, and he responded with, but the ancestors are dead and gone. I mean, here in the US, we're from all over. What would we need with ancestors? I know. But an ancestor, as a dear Anishinaabe friend reminds us all, is everything between heaven and earth. Not just human ancestors, but the bigger ancestors of land, wind, rivers, as well as the animals, birds, trees, and humans with whom we share life. But in our time and culture, we have kind of lost our big-heartedness of belonging to this greater ancestral world, as well as those of whom the Reformation's cancelling of ancestors bereft us, those dear ancestors whom we might pray with and talk to. That was all forbidden. So today, instead of seeing forebears who look upon us kindly and who still support us in a living way, we've resigned ourselves to this gloomy world of spooks and things that go bump in the night, and have entered into the horror story of those who are, in the words of my erstwhile publisher, just dead and gone. So I think this diminishment of our belonging to the ancestors has taken us away from our own continuance, and more critically, what should be our own full thoughtfulness for those who come after us has turned instead into this terrible forgetfulness where we do not look up or look ahead with responsive hearts. So the beauty of that belonging to the ancestors is the answer to our own sense of abandonment. Belonging was a central tenet of ancestral life. We are here for a short while, yes, and then others come, but the continuity of life is upheld in the world of creative joy and in the memories, and that is the song that forever sings. Of course, ancestors can exist in all manner of conditions, and a lot of my shamanic healing work is about dealing with the breakdowns and fragmentations of that belonging. But today I just really want us to comprehend that level of our human ancestors as not just the relatives we remember, but that greater company who were the raisers of the stones, thinking of them as the deep ancestors, the ones who are indeed the ancestors of us all, the ones who foresaw our coming and who had a sense of us in their hearts beyond time and space. So I'm sure that when you have visited, you've been aware of many site-specific guardians and ancestral matrices of understanding, and I'm pretty certain that you'll have your own experiences and ideas about those. But despite the immense amount of time between us, we can pick up on that vibe. And while we may have many ideas about why the stones were built, and there may have been many different reasons and purposes for that, burial, worship, marking the seasons, community cohesion, celebration of rites of passage, or the ritual enactment of many greater things, Our own reaction to these earth temples and other stones each brings us understanding and gives us perspective. So how is it possible to come into communication with the deep ancestors? And is it through the stones themselves and their guardians that a site can convey to us an embodied tradition of ancestral relationship? I think we can only do this when we are soul to soul with a place, when we become a participant with it as living people, not like the guardian. But by being and returning to a site and coming into a resonant relationship with it and the ancestors, we can receive the blessing of the earth temple and the ancestors and find that greater understanding. So there are a couple of ways that we can do this. The first is what I've already described at Must Farm, the going to a place, engaging in that sort of deep listening, what Aboriginal elders called the dadiri, not imposing ourselves upon a place, but being entirely one with it in quietness. And by this deep immersion, coming into a place where we can sound the site through vocalization. Now, this is much nearer to a Sami person's yoik, which is a tradition of singing that doesn't sing about a thing, it just utterly evokes the thing or place. And that's something we can all do at a site. And we need to enter into a simplicity without self-noticing, and then we can be with it in particular condition. We don't have to know anything to do this. It works by being receptive to a place at a level of cellular understanding and of body with soul, but not dominated or directed by mind. So I think humans generally are not very good at entering into the condition of the fey fear that Manannán Mac Lir created, the deer sinew, that cordon that is between ourselves and ancestral consciousness. But if we think of any henge with its bank and ditch, it will remind us that this primal enclosure of belonging can be an enlargement of our memory, and we can be inside it and be welcomed. So over many years, I've been shown a deeper way that requires more engagement, and we need 3 doorways to enter into this ancestral communion. I find it interesting that these 3 doorways, which I'll just describe, are actually the same as the prerequisites to prayer and also for contact with the hidden ones, with the fairy beings who are our neighbours. And they relate to each other in order. So the first one is peacefulness, the second is the seer's vision, and the third is the soul's touch. So peacefulness is like the state of a small child at rest. It needs a soft belly, so not knotted up with aggression, anger, or emotion. And it's also a state of being that's non-aggressive, non-competitive, and non-acquisitive. And it's certainly absent of any of that sort of awful self-regard that we see so much on the internet. Hey, look at me being spiritual, especially on social media. So any sense of that, and your peacefulness just cancels itself pretty quickly. So basically, it's a primary kind of attention necessary to be true to our own nature. Now, seer's vision is my term for what brings our consciousness into attention without forcing. It may require us to close our eyes. It helps us to be in a place of darkness. Shawl over the head, scarf around the eyes will help. And it's also taking our sense of peacefulness just a little bit deeper, becoming like a child just before it wakes up. Not yet out of the dream, and not yet in our first conscious thought, which, as we all know, breaks the dream. So when we close our eyes or enter into darkness, the phosphenes behind our eyes will still be active. And they are particularly active just as you're rising up from sleep. You have to do it very slowly. I used to call them the shapers, but they're actually, they form into things which we can see as entoptic symbols behind our eyes. And they swirl rhythmically like dancers, with the lozenges, the spirals, the reiterations and echoes of lines that ripple outwards. And you'll recognise them because, of course, they're just like these ones here on the forecourt stone from the brew. They're also like the interlacing ripples on a river as they spill and travel across the surface of the water. But you need to be very still and not actively thinking to experience these. Of course, they're very similar to the images that occur when people are led into caves and dark places. But I suggest that you try this when you wake up. Just wake up very slowly. The minute you've heard, oh, today's Monday, or whatever, it will just vanish. But just be aware as you come up, rather like a fish rising up to the surface of the water from sleep. And you'll see them, they're there. And these shapers are the sign of our accord with ancestral or fairy beings, that we're in a state to acknowledge them and all that is. The soul's touch is just sort of my clumsy way of describing something that you'll understand quite well. When you have any kind of interaction or dialogue with the ancestors or the hidden ones, you really have to have the demeanour of someone who is going to be with a small child or with a very sensitive animal. I'm sure that many of you have tried to worm your cat or dog, or maybe catch a horse in a field to put a headstall on it. And you know that if you psychically signal that you were about to do something to an animal, it will evade you entirely. It's the same here. So that soul's touch is very, very, very gentle. In fact, the sort of the polite thing to do very often is to show yourself and not do anything, not try to get any closer. But also if you have an animal and you've been sitting in the evening quite quietly and restfully, and then you suddenly have one of those, oh God, did I switch off the oven? Or one of those thoughts, because your soul spikes and the animal leaps away very quickly from you because they pick up your alarm. So that soul is like the deer's sinew. It's stretchy and tangible. And it's very gentle. So peacefulness, the seer's vision, and then soul's touch. And then, having allowed yourself to be noticed, then you can enter into something a little deeper. So this slowing down and coming into a different state of consciousness helps us enter into the living memory of our ancestors who were ancestralized at the stones and in other places. So we talk about living memory. Let's just look at that for a moment. When an Indigenous person talks about living memory, they're not talking about their own single lifetime. They're talking about the life memory of a whole group of people who are generationally connected. And so the memories of my mother and father and their parents and that of my great-grandparents, my uncles and aunts, they're all part of my living memory, as is my son's life memory and that of my young granddaughters and their children who are not yet born. They're also part of my memory. And that's how a living memory can be equivalent to 150, 170 years. Of course, each of us come with these huge collective memories which will be present and will be passed on. But how long that living memory lasts within a collective, I suppose, may be gauged. I have a friend who lives in a Herefordshire village, and the older people in his village still talk about the people who live on the ridge as kind of recent ancestors, and they often refer to them in common parlance as, well, the people on the ridge would do a better job. Well, I wouldn't think much of that, if some desperate council decision comes down. But of course, an archaeologist would tell you that the ridge over this village hasn't actually been occupied since the Iron Age. So that's quite a long memory. And of course, now that we have DNA, we have a very different sense of ancestors, because very often people have thought of their ancestors as somehow alien to them. But we've only got to look at the village of Bleeden in Wiltshire when they dug up an Iron Age man there in the early part of this millennium. And they DNA'd all the villagers, 48% of whom were directly descended from him, and they did a facial reconstruction. And I remember watching this on television. They all assembled in the church hall. The cloth was taken off the model of the reconstruction, and everyone gasped and turned round because he was standing at the back of the hall. And the man at the back of the hall could have been this facial reconstruction, his brother or his uncle. It was very difficult. So we look like our ancestors, and we sound like them too. Our larynxes aren't that different from those ones of the Neolithic. So such encounters can bring us into a better understanding of generations of ancestors who are not just human and who extend our living memory. I'm sure that you've noticed that when you go to a site, that you very often find that an animal leads you to notice a particular part of the site where you're standing. And there are several traditional sayings that bring us into range of even longer memory. And one of them from the Book of Lismore tells us about a year for a stake, 3 lives of a stake for a field, 3 lifetimes of the field for the hound, 3 lives of the hound for the horse, 3 lives of the horse for the man, 3 lifetimes of a man for the stag, 3 lives of the stag for the ouzel, 3 lives of the ouzel for the eagle, 3 lifetimes of the eagle for the salmon, 3 lives of the salmon for the ewe, 3 lifetimes of the ewe for the ridge, 3 lifetimes of a ridge from the beginning to the end of the world. So this saying connects us with the oldest animals, the story of Mabon ap Modron, the primal god of innocence and liberation, whose myth takes us back to the roots of time, when, as the story says, he was taken between his mother and the wall when he was just 3 days old, and no one now knows whether he is alive or dead. And it's only by engaging the memories of the oldest animals that he can be found, because when human memory runs out, the speaker of tongues, Guria, in the story of Kiluk and Olwen, goes and speaks to them, and the blackbird directs them to the stag, and the stag to the owl, and the owl to the eagle, and each one has served a very long time. The eagle has pecked a mountain right down from the top to the bottom. But he's put his talons into the salmon, and the salmon has told him something about something going on at Caerloy, which is Gloucester. And there Mabon is cracked out by Arthur's men, many of whom are from very, very many ages. They're not just from Arthur's court, they're mythological people. And they come forth, and the oldest animals are the ones that bring him back to attention again, because he has to take the comb and scissors from between the ears of the great Tuach, the ravaging boar, to barber the giant Asbaddaden. And so Mabon is a kind of model of all sleepers who awaken, bringing back to living memory that which has been lost. And so that brightness of memory lies also in the stones, as any stonemason's chisel tells you. If it's not a stone that's going to be useful, it won't ring. So none of those stones that are at Higglesdean and Lockridge which we sort of see sort of half ready to be put up and taken away, they don't make any sound. So they can't join the circle. So there's something about the resonance of the stones with the memory. So some places have a coordinated resonance that's very clear even to the most shut down of persons. And when sites have been worked for millennia, or lived near, or worshipped with sustained devotion, they acquire a resonance beyond the normal. And they do qualify as ancestral temples that can indeed be called perpetual choirs of song. But I just want to sort of break down that. In the Welsh, the triad that talks about the 3 choirs is Tri Dafal Gyfangwan, Oeth Gynt yr amser y Britanniaid, Bangor y Chwaer Gariadog, agus Ynys Wytrin. So it's Tri Dafal Gyfangwan, and that actually translates as 3 continuous harmonies. It's usually translated as perpetual choirs, but there's something about Dafal, which is in Welsh, which has a sense of enduring or persistent even. It has a harmony that goes on and on. Now, there are several Welsh sources for this. The earliest that we can trace goes back to about 1604 in a written tradition, but of course the Welsh have an oral tradition as well, so we may take that back further if you wish. The Edward Ellis triad translates like this: the three perpetual harmonies or choirs of the island of Britain. One was in the Isle of Avallon, or here. The second is at Caer Caradoc, which might be Salisbury or might be Sarum. The third is Bangor Ysgoed in Flintshire. And in each of these three abbeys were 2,400 religious persons, 100 being appointed to attend the choir for each hour, so that they chanted in rotation without intermission. And in the course of the day and night, the whole performed the duty, so that the service of God might be praised without ceasing. So these persistent harmonies or ongoing harmonies refer, of course, to the chanting of the divine office of the 150 Psalms of David, which were and still are recited at the 7 canonical hours throughout the day and night by most enclosed monks and nuns. That's their job. It's called the divine office, and that's what they're employed to do above everything. When we forget to pray, they keep up a circuit of prayer around the day and night, often getting up in the middle of the night to do it in more seriously enclosed orders. But of course, these are not the only singings that we hear about. And Terence earlier this morning mentioned Pythias and the tradition that's come down via him and Hecataeus to Diodorus Siculus. And I'm just going to read the very short version of that. So beyond the regions of the Celts there lies an island no smaller than Sicily, inhabited by the Hyperboreans, called so because their home is beyond the north wind. Leto was born in this island, and Apollo is honoured there above all other gods. The inhabitants are considered as priests of Apollo because they daily praise him in song. There is a sacred precinct of Apollo and a temple adorned with votive offerings, which is spherical in shape. In a city there sacred to this god, the majority of its people play on the kithara, continually playing in the temple, glorifying him. They say the moon is viewed from this island, appears close to the earth, and the god visits the island every 19 years, Metonic cycle, and plays the kithara and dances continuously from the spring equinox until the rising of the Pleiades, which of course is Samhain, November time, what is now. And the kings and high priests of the precinct are called the Boreadae, the succession that is always kept in their family. So, there are lots of interpretations of this, and I think we could probably argue with the toss from now till eternity about it, but I don't know the spherical temple. Is it Stonehenge? Is it Callanish? The island of Sicily is about 9,924 square miles, and the Isle of Lewis is a bit less than that. It's about 68. But it's certainly, the island of Britain isn't smaller than Sicily. That I do know, so whether that's an instance. But if we go with the Callanish one, of course we have the Metonic cycle of the moon appearing over the Cailleach na Muintir, the old woman of the moor, which is the mountain range to the south of Callanish that's shaped like a woman lying on her side, on her back. And the moon, of course, appears from what appears to be the crevice of her womb every 19 years, which is when Apollo, possibly Mabon, dances. It's a part of the world where that's possible. So the picture painted by Diodorus of a hereditary priesthood who maintain a continuous harmony upon the kithara or harp sounds like a ritual of Neolithic people in Greek, people who live beyond the north wind, who keep faith with the song, and whose song still sings to us. So these perpetual or enduring harmonies are available to us at the stone sites, are indeed choirs. They don't sing of the Psalms of David, of course, but it's a vast collective of concentrated ancestral song that resonates through time and space, and which we can still be a part. This ancestral joining of the memories is possible when we enter into those three doorways, the peacefulness, the seer's vision, the soul's touch. But we have to realize when we do this that it really is a two-way street. We are regarded, and so the ancestors will know about us as well as about the chief concerns of our society, which also have a collective consciousness, although it's not one that's boundaried by sacred respect or connectedly cohesive by ancestral standards. So when you're dialoguing with ancestors at sacred places, it's often galling, even humiliating, to feel that grind of difference between the Neolithic consciousness of what is enduringly important and our own time's quite empty and selfish concerns. So, I think we've had a lot of theory for me, so I think we should have some practice now. Now, I know that we have very many different views from each other, and we have different voices and facets of understanding. And while we may not sing in union or in unison, we can sing in harmony. So the voices that sing together join the voices that are already singing. And the voice that coordinates our song is a much greater presence. In my talk, I've been talking about it, possibly Apollo, possibly Mabon, the native version of the Pan-Celtic Maponis, whose story obviously goes back a very long way and harmonizes all beings into one chorus, and who gathers all that is forgotten into a continuous memorization, which is an anamnesis of something that our ancestors deeply understood. So shortly, I'm going to invite you to bring your voice to the surface and to sing what comes when you regard a particular stone site that you're most drawn to. So the earth of your place is singing together with the ancestral voices of other places. We're not aiming for grand opera, and even if you don't regard yourself as a singer, I know that you can speak because I've heard you all, and singing is just speaking without the words getting in the way, okay? We also know that sound endures. Astrophysics tells us that the sound of dead stars, dying stars, is still reaching us. So the power of sound is extensive and permeating every recess. So we can let our voices join together in harmony, mindful that we're here in one room. So we don't have to have special skills, and we don't have to have anything except our voices and a sincere heart. So to help you focus this, I want you to focus to three things. Firstly, what is the place that calls out to you? A place that you know and which knows you, because we're going to be sounding the harmony of that place primarily, and you can stay with that, that's absolutely fine. As we sing a little bit longer, you may find that you can allow your voice to join those of ancestors who are already singing, the enduring harmony, which might be the stones themselves, the place where they are sited, the ancestors who helped raise them, those who came and who gathered there after the stones were raised, or for the very purpose of the temples themselves. So that's a sort of secondary layer. And as we go on a little longer, we're going to try and let the harmony join together and sound through time into timelessness for all who are going to visit your place in times yet to come. So that's for our descendants, so that they may be able to perceive and receive the song and the joined up living memories. We don't need to encode any special messages. It's just we're singing the harmony and the sound will do the rest. And then lastly, when the singing dies away, to please just allow the silence that follows it to remain. The sound will still be shimmering in the cells of our own bodies and in your place. And that's when we may be aware of something really quite precious. So you'll hear the bells of my branch, which I have here, to signal the end of that silence, so that you have a sense of that. So I'm going to lead you into this, and I'm going to start with a little tuning in first. So that's not the singing you have to join in with, but and I'll just sort of lead you verbally into where we're going. So just be aware that we've been sitting in this room which has almost no air in it, and that you'll probably need to sit up a little bit so that your poor diaphragm can get some air in and out, and that will result in some sound. So there are no drums in this. This is just allowing it to come. Okay. Fee for Arun, fee for Arun, fee for Arun, fee for So be aware of the ground beneath you and the sky above, the directions on every side. Be aware of stillness, silence, and spaciousness, which become like three concentric doors through which you can pass. And we each pass through them, going to the place that calls to you most strongly, a physical location existing in time and space. It may be a sacred site or one known only to you as sacred. Be aware of your place as it appears to you. Be aware of what is with you, the sacred spaciousness of your place that opens out in you also. Find where you want to be within your place, standing by a stone, entering into a chamber or passageway, or some other part of your place. And with a soft belly and gentle breathing, come into the presence of your place. Be aware of the treasury of ancestral wisdom that exists between time and timelessness, place and space, a wisdom and a memory that is made whole and unified in this spaciousness. Greet the place and listen. And when you are ready, sing what comes in response, and we will continue to sing it for a while. Thank you.